One would think that when Burkina Faso cut off ties with France last year, we wouldn't hear anything regarding France and Burkina Faso again. But since France was kicked out last year, we have heard news of how France has been causing destabilization in not just Burkina Faso, but in the Sahel region as a whole. And according to President Traore, France is doing so through neighboring African countries, including Ivory Coast and Benin Republic. Now, as if that is not enough, recent reports have revealed that a French warship just arrived off the coast of Ivory Coast. This is particularly interesting because if you recall that there have been tensions between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast in recent months, with President Traore accusing the authorities of Ivory Coast, which everyone knows are French allies, of collaborating with France to cause destabilization in Burkina Faso. So when a French warship carrying hundreds of troops, helicopters, and military vehicles arrives close to Burkina Faso, you can understand why the situation just became even more critical. So the question is, what exactly is going on? What is France planning? Is France planning to fight insecurity in Ivory Coast, or is there an ulterior motive? Let's find out. So for starters, it's no longer news that the geopolitical dynamics in Francophone Africa has changed in recent times. Usually all Francophone countries used to be strong allies of France, completely dependent on France for trade and security issues. France was basically the go-to for everything. However, the wave of coups, which began in Mali in 2020 and spread across West Africa, completely changed everything. These coups brought a kind of separation amongst Francophone countries, not just because the coups brought in military leaders, but primarily because it separated Francophone countries into those who remained allies of France and those who ditched France. But it wasn't just France that was affected, it was basically the West and Europe in general. The coups brought in leaders that prioritized the sovereignty of their countries above the relations and interest of the West, hence the distance. However, it seemed to hit France more, probably because France was the former colonial master of Francophone Africa. Anti-French sentiments spread across the Sahel, leading to a breakdown in relations with France, which led to kicking out French military and diplomatic relations. So, while you have Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso on one side pushing against France influence, countries like Ivory Coast, Gabon, and Benin Republic, just to name a few, remain committed to France. Now think about it. Given this backdrop, doesn't it seem suspicious that France decided to send a warship to Ivory Coast, knowing fully well that it shares a boundary with Burkina Faso? It certainly does. However, the official reason France gave for sending its warship to Ivory Coast is that it wants to fight illegal fishing, drug trafficking, and piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. But the question is, why do they need 300 troops, 60 military vehicles, and a couple of military helicopters for that? And let's not also forget another important question: why now? If you have been following the history of France and Africa, you would understand why these questions are necessary. Because the fact is that when it comes to Africa and the West, there is always an ulterior motive. And the ulterior motive always ends with African countries getting the short end of the stick. It has been consistent, and this time will not be different. But one other question that should be asked is, why did the authorities in Ivory Coast accept a French warship on its coast, especially given the fact that its neighbor Burkina Faso has a problem with France? You see, this is the problem of Africa. African countries are not united at all, and that is why it's so easy for the West to continue to exploit the continent while the leaders are busy watching. Let's analyze this critically. Just last month, Denmark announced that it will shut down its embassy in Burkina Faso and Mali. Why? This is where it's interesting. It's not because Burkina Faso and Mali made an offensive statement about Denmark or did something wrong. It doesn't even have anything to do with the fact that a coup occurred in these countries and they are no longer democratic. You will be shocked to know the reason. So, here's the official statement from the Denmark Foreign Ministry. It reads as follows: Denmark will close its embassies in Burkina Faso and Mali and open new missions in Senegal, Tunisia, and Rwanda as part of a new Africa strategy. As a result of military coups that have severely limited the scope for action in the Sahel region, the embassies in Burkina Faso and Mali will be closed. Relations between the two Sahel nations and several Western countries have deteriorated since the military coups in Burkina Faso in 2022 and Mali in 2020. So from the first statement, Denmark says it will shut down its embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso and open new ones in Senegal, Tunisia, and Rwanda as part of a new Africa strategy. And the reason for this is because of the military coups, which have severely limited the scope for action in the Sahel region. What this simply means is that Denmark is shutting down its embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso because the coups in these countries led to a shifting alliances from the West and Europe to the East, including Russia and China. You see, it's not simply because of the coups that happened in these countries. If it were, Denmark would have also shut down its embassy in Gabon, where a coup also occurred. So it's simply because the military leaders began to turn their countries away from Europe and the West. What does this tell you? It means that the West and Europe are united. The major reason why Denmark chose to shut down its embassy is because it observed that Burkina Faso and Mali have cut ties with several Western countries. And as a show of solidarity and unity, Denmark has decided to follow suit. Not surprisingly, a few days before Denmark made this decision, Mali and Niger had severed ties with Sweden, another Scandinavian country like Denmark. So, it's not too far-fetched to say that Denmark's decision was reinforced by this move by Niger and Mali. The question is, why can't Africa be united like this? The fact is, the West is making progress because every country is united. The US hates Russia and wants to reduce China's influence in Africa. And guess what? All the Western countries, including European countries, have automatically turned Russia into an enemy and wants to reduce the influence of China across the globe. In Africa, however, this is not the case. Some in Africa are allies of the West, some others are against the West, and some others are neutral. This ought not to be so. African countries need to have solidarity and show solidarity with their fellow African countries. Think about it. Imagine as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger shunned the West, and countries like Ivory Coast decided to follow suit. Do you think a French warship would be present in the waters of Ivory Coast? The answer is no. Imagine if every African country worked together to combat the insecurity in the Sahel region, the DRC and Sudan. Do you think that foreign military bases would be scattered all over the continent? The answer is no. There would be no foreign military bases. No issue of France stopping Burkina Faso from buying military equipment to outfit its military. No issue of foreign soldiers sexually assaulting young boys and girls in the DRC. No issue of exploitation of Africa's resources. The key to Africa's growth is to be united. The fact is that Africa is very important to the world. Even though the West continues to push this narrative that Africa is nerdy and poor, haven't you observed that every Western and European country always has a policy and strategy towards Africa? This is evident in what the Foreign Minister of Denmark said in his statement. He said, "Africa's geopolitical relevance and importance in international politics has never been greater. Their populations, economies, and assertiveness are growing. In 2050, 1 in every 4 people in the world will live in Africa. 1 in every 3 of the world's youth will be African." This is why even though some countries such as the Sahel region have shifted from the West, none of these Western countries wants to leave the continent completely. They are still fighting to have a stakeholder in the continent. Now, if only African leaders can realize that Africa is the future. If they do realize how important Africa is to the rest of the world, then we wouldn't have puppets that dance to the tune of the West. Africa would have leaders that are bold and assertive and speak their mind and value their sovereignty above anything else, like Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. Africa is the future, and it's high time African leaders realize that and start acting accordingly. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.